The heat in the town square did not just rise from the earth. It pressed down from a white iron sky, flattening the breath in every throat that dared to draw air. Lynn stood on the raised wooden platform, the rough grain of the planks burning the soles of her bare feet, though she refused to shift her weight. To move was to show discomfort, and to show discomfort was to give Mayor Halloway exactly what he wanted. She wore a traditional cheongsam that had once been the color of slate and rain, but the journey in the holding cell had turned it into a tattered rag of gray dust and fraying silk. The high collar, usually a symbol of dignity, was unbuttoned to allow her to breathe, exposing the hollow of her throat where a pulse hammered like a trapped bird. Her hands were bound behind her back, the hemp rope coarse and tight enough to bite into the skin, cutting off the circulation until her fingers felt like distant foreign things. She kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, past the gathered crowd of miners, drifters, and railway laborers who looked at her with a mixture of pity and hunger. She would not look at Halloway. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing the fear that churned in her gut like spoiled water. Halloway paced the edge of the platform, his boots loud and deliberate, polished to a shine that offended the dusty reality of the frontier. He wiped his brow with a handkerchief that was startlingly white. He was a man who weaponized paperwork and laws, twisting the town's statutes until they became a cage for anyone who couldn't pay his arbitrary taxes. Lynn was his latest example, a lesson to the immigrant community about the cost of overdue debts. He stopped beside her, gripping her shoulder with a hand that felt heavy and possessive. She flinched, a microscopic movement, but he laughed as if she had screamed. He announced to the crowd that she was damaged goods, a burden on the town's resources, and that since no family had come to claim her, she was to be offloaded to anyone willing to take the expense of feeding her. It was a humiliation ritual, designed to strip her of value before the eyes of the town. The silence that followed his proclamation was thick, uncomfortable, and heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies and stale tobacco. "No takers?" Halloway's voice boomed, theatrical and cruel. "She's quiet, obedient, a bit thin, but she'll work for her keep." He looked at Lynn, his voice dropping to a sneer that only she in the front row could hear. "Look at them. Nobody wants a problem, Lynn. You're just a problem." He turned back to the crowd. "Tell you what, I'm feeling generous today. The town needs to be clean of vagrants. The price is $0. I'll give her for free to any man who takes her out of my jurisdiction within the hour. Just sign the transfer paper." The insult was total. He wasn't selling her. He was discarding her like refuse. A murmur went through the crowd, but no one moved. To take Halloway's cast-off was to invite Halloway's scrutiny, and nobody wanted the mayor's eyes on their business. Then, the rhythmic jingle of spurs cut through the murmuring. The sound was distinct, heavy, and deliberate. The crowd parted not out of politeness, but out of the instinctual preservation that prey feels when a predator enters the clearing. A man walked forward. He was tall, coated in the dust of the trail, wearing a duster that had seen more storms than most men saw in a lifetime. His face was a map of hard terrain, shadowed by the brim of his hat, but his jaw was set like granite. This was Thorne. He stopped at the foot of the steps, his presence cooling the air around him. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked only at Halloway, and then, briefly, at Lynn. His eyes were dark, unreadable, and terrifyingly calm. He walked up the steps, the wood creaking under his weight. He didn't ask for permission. He simply reached out and took the transfer paper from Halloway's stunned hand, scrawled an X and a signature that looked like a jagged scar, and shoved it into his pocket. Halloway blinked, his polished veneer cracking for a second before he recovered his sneer. He looked from the gun on Thorne's hip to the tattered woman. "You're making a mistake, stranger," Halloway said, his voice oily with false concern. "She's got a stubborn streak wide as the canyon. You're taking on a burden." Lynn felt the world tilt. She looked at the man, Thorne. He smelled of gun oil, leather, and horses. He was terrifying in his size, a mountain of silence. She forced her dry lips apart, the words scraping her throat, needing to warn him, needing to maintain some scrap of agency even as she was being traded. "You will regret choosing me," she whispered, the words trembling but audible in the hushed square. Thorne stopped. He turned slowly to look at her, his eyes finally locking onto hers. There was no pity in them, only a profound, weary recognition. His voice was a low rumble, rough like gravel shifting under boots. "I only regret waiting so long." He drew a knife, not to threaten but to slash the ropes binding her wrists in one fluid motion. The ropes fell away. He didn't touch her. He just turned his back to Halloway and began to walk away, expecting her to follow. The walk from the town square to the hitching post felt like a dream sequence where the dreamer tries to run through water. Lynn's wrists burned as the blood rushed back into her hands, a stinging reminder that she was alive, though she wasn't sure if she was safe. She followed Thorne, keeping 2 paces behind him, her head lowered but her eyes darting left and right. The town watched them go. The silence was different now. It wasn't the silence of anticipation, but the silence of judgment. She felt the weight of the gray cheongsam clinging to her legs, the fabric torn at the hem, flapping in the hot wind. It was a garment meant for a different life, a life of tea ceremonies and clean floors, not this dusty hellscape where she was bartered for nothing. Thorne reached his horse, a massive roan beast that snorted as they approached. He didn't mount immediately. Instead, he opened a saddlebag and pulled out a canteen. He turned to her, and for the first time they were close enough for her to see the fine lines around his eyes and the white scar that cut through his eyebrow. He held the canteen out. It was an offering, not a command. Lynn hesitated. Her training, her survival instincts screamed at her to be submissive, to wait for orders, to make herself small. But this man offered water before he offered rules. She took the canteen with shaking hands, the metal cool against her feverish skin. She drank too fast, water spilling down her chin, staining the dusty collar of her dress. He didn't scold her. He didn't laugh. He simply waited until she lowered the vessel, gasping for air. "We ride until sundown," Thorne said. His voice was flat, devoid of the aggression she was used to hearing from men. "Can you ride, or do you need to sit behind me?" "I can sit behind," Lynn said, her voice raspy. She had never ridden a horse alone, and she wasn't going to admit that weakness now, but she also couldn't physically pull herself up. Thorne nodded. He mounted first, the leather creaking, and then extended a hand down to her. His hand was large, the skin rough and calloused, stained with the work of survival. She looked at it for a long second. Taking his hand felt like signing a contract far more binding than the paper Halloway had waved. It was a surrender of gravity. She reached up. His grip was firm, pulling her up with a strength that was shocking in its ease. She settled behind him, her hands hovering uncertainly near his waist. "Hold on," he said, not unkindly. "The roan doesn't like surprises." She wrapped her arms tentatively around his midsection, feeling the rigid wall of muscle and the heavy leather of his duster. They rode out of town, leaving the suffocating order of Halloway's law for the chaotic freedom of the scrublands. The landscape was vast and indifferent, a sprawling canvas of ochre dirt and sagebrush that stretched endlessly toward purple mountains. The heat didn't abate, but the movement of the horse created a breeze that dried the sweat on Lynn's face. For hours they didn't speak. The only sounds were the rhythmic pounding of hooves, the creak of the saddle, and the dry hiss of the wind through the brush. Lynn spent the time cataloging her fears. Who was he? Why had he taken her? Men didn't do things for free. especially not men who looked like they killed for a living. She watched the back of his neck, the way his hair curled slightly over the collar, waiting for the violence she knew must be simmering beneath that stoic surface. But the violence didn't come. They stopped as the sun began to bleed into the western horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and blood orange. It was a small clearing near a trickle of water that passed for a creek in this territory. Thorne dismounted and helped her down. Her legs were jelly, vibrating from the ride. She stumbled, and he caught her elbow to steady her, releasing her instantly once she had her balance. "We camp here," he stated. He began to strip the gear off the horse with practiced efficiency. Lynn stood there, useless, her hands clasping her own elbows. She felt the sting of the rope burns on her wrists, red and raw. Thorne finished with the horse and turned to her. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small tin. He motioned for her hands. Lynn flinched, pulling back. Thorne stopped, his hands suspended in the air. "Salve," he said quietly. "For the wrists. It prevents infection." He didn't grab her. He waited. It was the waiting that broke her defense. She slowly extended her arms. He applied the salve with a touch so light it felt like a ghost's caress. The stinging subsided into a cool numbness. He was treating her like he treated his horse, with care, with maintenance, with respect for the creature's value. It was more than she had received in years. The shack was nestled in a box canyon, hidden from the main trail by a cluster of twisted juniper trees and a natural rockfall that looked impassable until you were right on top of it. It was a structure of gray wood and tin, patched together with determination rather than skill, but it held against the wind. This was the third day since they had left the town. They had fallen into a silence that was less about tension and more about the exhaustion of survival. Inside, the cabin was sparse. A wood stove, a single cot, a table with 2 chairs. Thorne took the floor. He had given her the cot on the first night without a word, throwing his bedroll near the door as if he were a guard dog rather than a master. Morning came with the smell of coffee. It was a rich, dark scent that seemed to push back the stale air of the shack. Lynn sat up, pulling the thin blanket around her shoulders. Her Cheong Sam was cleaner now. She had washed it in the creek the day before while Thorne was hunting, scrubbing the fabric until her knuckles were raw. It was still tattered, but the dust of the prison cell was gone. She watched him at the stove. He moved with an economy of motion that fascinated her. He didn't waste energy. Every step, every reach had a purpose. He poured 2 tin cups of coffee and set one on the table. "Drink," he said. It wasn't an order, it was a notification. She sat at the table, wrapping her hands around the hot metal cup. "Why?" she asked. It was the first question she had dared to ask since the auction. Thorne looked at her, blowing steam off his cup. "Why what?" he replied, his voice gravelly with sleep. "Why, this." She gestured to the room, to the coffee, to the space between them. "You paid. You took me. You asked for nothing." Thorne took a slow sip. He set the cup down and looked at his hands, turning them over to inspect a callus. "I didn't pay for you, Lynn. I paid to make the paper go away." He looked up, his eyes hard but not unkind. "I don't own people. I don't keep slaves. You're here because the alternative was a cell or a brothel. When you're ready to leave, the door is unlocked." He stood up and walked to the corner where his gear lay. He picked up a small knife, a working blade with a bone handle. He walked over and placed it on the table in front of her. "But until you leave, you need to know how to keep yourself." Lynn stared at the knife. It was sharp, lethal, and he was giving it to her. A weapon. In Halloway's town, a woman like her holding a weapon was a crime punishable by whipping. Here, it was a gift. "I don't know how," she whispered. "I'll teach you," Thorne said. "Not to fight like a soldier, to fight like you want to live." He went back to his coffee. Lynn reached out and touched the handle of the knife. The wood was smooth. It felt heavy, grounded. For the first time, the silence in the room didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a pause, a breath before the world started again. The peace of the canyon was fragile, a bubble of silence in a land that loved noise and violence. It broke 5 days later. Lynn was outside, hanging wet cloth on a line strung between two junipers, when she saw the birds rise. A flock of crows erupted from the tree line a mile down the canyon, cawing in agitation. Thorne was inside cleaning his rifle, but he was out the door before the echo of the birds had faded. He didn't say a word. He looked at the sky, then at the ground, reading the story written in the disturbance. "Get inside," he said, his voice low and sharp. "Bar the door. Don't open it unless you hear my voice." Lynn didn't argue. She grabbed the laundry basket and ran for the shack, the fear returning instantly, a cold, familiar companion. She slid the heavy wooden bolt into place and backed away into the shadows, clutching the bone-handled knife he had given her. Through the cracks in the wooden shutters, she watched. Thorne stood in the clearing, his rifle resting easily in the crook of his arm, his body relaxed but coiled. Minutes ticked by, stretching like taffy. Then, riders emerged from the scrub. 3 of them. They wore dusters and carried the confident slouch of men who were paid to be violent. Enforcers. Not lawmen, but Halloway's private dogs. They pulled up 10 yards from Thorne. The lead rider, a man with a face like a crumpled paper bag, leaned over his saddle horn. "Thorne," the man spat, smiling with yellow teeth. "Mayor Halloway sends his regards. Says there was a clerical error with the transaction. Says the girl has outstanding debts." Thorne didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. "Transaction is closed. Paper is signed." The rider laughed, looking at his companions. "Paper gets lost, Thorne. Taxes accrue. Mayor says he wants the girl back for reassessment. Or he wants $1,000 in gold." Lynn's heart hammered against her ribs. She pressed her hand over her mouth to stifle her breathing. $1,000 was a fortune. It was impossible. Thorne shifted his weight. "No," he said. The word hung in the air, absolute and final. The rider stopped smiling. "You're one man, Thorne. We're 3, and the law ain't on your side out here." Thorne finally raised the rifle, not aiming it, just shifting the barrel so it pointed vaguely at the lead rider's chest. "There's no law out here," Thorne said. "Just us. Turn around." The tension was a physical thing, a wire pulled tight enough to snap. The rider looked at Thorne's eyes, then at the rifle, then back at the silent cabin. He spat on the ground. "This ain't over. Halloway don't like losing his toys." They wheeled their horses around, kicking up a cloud of dust that choked the air, and rode back the way they came. Thorne watched them until they were gone, not moving a muscle until the sound of hooves faded completely. That night the wind picked up, howling through the canyon like a mourning spirit. The encounter with the riders had changed the air in the cabin. The safety felt thinner, temporary. Thorne was restless. He checked the window shutters 3 times. He cleaned his revolver, the metallic clicks loud in the small room. Lynn sat on her cot watching him. She realized then that he wasn't invincible. He was just a man, standing between her and a machine of power that wanted to crush her. He was tired. The lines around his eyes were deeper tonight. Suddenly, a different sound cut through the wind, a high-pitched, desperate cry. It wasn't a bird. It was a child's voice, screaming in panic. Thorne froze. "Wait here," he commanded, moving toward the door. "No," Lynn said, standing up. "It's a trap." "Maybe," Thorne said, grabbing his rifle. "But if it's not?" He opened the door and vanished into the dark. Lynn stood there, the knife in her hand. Minutes passed. Then she heard a shout, Thorne's voice, followed by the sickening crack of a gunshot. Then silence. Fear, cold and paralyzing, washed over her. But beneath the fear was something else. Anger. Anger that she was always the one waiting, always the one hiding while others bled. If Thorne was down, she was next. But if Thorne was down, he was down because of her. The choice crystallized in her mind. She could run. The back window was loose. She could slip out into the darkness and take her chances in the wild. Or she could open the door. She looked at the bone-handled knife. Fight like you want to live. She unbarred the door. She stepped out into the swirling dust. The moon was obscured by clouds. She crept toward the sound of the struggle. In the brush, she saw shapes. Thorne was on the ground, grappling with a man. Not one of the riders from before, but a scout, smaller and quicker. The scout had a rock raised high. Thorne was pinned, his movements sluggish, blood dark on his shoulder where a bullet had grazed him. He hadn't seen the second man. Lynn didn't think. She didn't announce herself. She ran, her bare feet silent on the earth. She didn't go for the kill. She went for the distraction. She picked up a heavy branch and swung it with all her strength against the scout's ribs. The wood cracked. The man howled, dropping the rock and rolling off Thorne. Thorne didn't waste the second. He rolled, drew his sidearm, and the night flashed white with the muzzle flare. The scout slumped. Thorne scrambled up, breathless, clutching his shoulder. He looked at the dead man, then at Lynn, who stood shivering, holding a broken stick, her eyes wide with the shock of her own action. He didn't tell her to go back inside. He nodded, a sharp, respectful acknowledgement. "Help me up," he said. It was the first time he had asked her for help. She moved to his side, letting him lean his weight on her shoulder, and together they walked back to the light of the cabin. The heavy wooden door groaned as Lynn shoved the bolt back into place, sealing the cabin against the night and the threats that lurked within it. The silence that returned was sudden and ringing, amplified by the heavy breathing of the man slumped in the single wooden chair. Thorne had tossed his duster onto the floor, his shirt peeled back to reveal the angry, bleeding furrow across his left shoulder where the scout's bullet had bitten him. The wound was ugly, a tear through muscle and skin, but it wasn't fatal. What shook Lynn wasn't the blood. It was the way Thorne sat, still, eyes closed, his head tipped back against the wall, surrendering control for the first time since she had met him. He looked mortal now. The invincible gunman who had walked into Halloway's square was gone, replaced by a man made of exhaustion and flesh. Lynn moved to the stove, her hands trembling not from fear anymore, but from the adrenaline crash. She poured hot water into a basin and grabbed a clean cloth. The same routine of care he had shown her, now reversed. She approached him slowly. "I need to clean it," she said, her voice quiet in the dim room. Thorne opened his eyes. They were dark, dilated with pain, but clear. He nodded once, a small concession. She stepped between his spread knees, the intimacy of the position hitting her like a physical wave. She wringed out the cloth, the steam rising in the cool air, smelling of iron and wood smoke. When she touched the warm, damp fabric to his shoulder, his muscles seized, tight as bowstrings. He hissed a breath through his teeth but didn't pull away. "I'm sorry," she whispered, dabbing away the blood. "Do not be," he rasped, watching her face. "Pain tells you you're still here." Lynn worked methodically, her fingers brushing against his skin, feeling the heat of him, the rough texture of old scars that mapped his chest and arms. There were so many marks, white lines of knives, puckered circles of old bullets. He was a tapestry of violence survived. She paused, her hand resting lightly on his uninjured shoulder to steady herself. "You have so many scars," she murmured, almost to herself. Thorne looked up at her, his gaze intense and unblinking. "Every one of them is a mistake," he said softly. "A moment I was too slow, or too trusting. He reached up with his good hand and covered hers where it rested on his chest. His palm was rough, calloused, but his grip was incredibly gentle. You are the only thing I have chosen that wasn't a mistake. The admission hung between them, heavier than the gun on the table. Lynn felt a flush rise in her neck. It wasn't a flowery declaration. It was a fact, stated with the same gravity as a death sentence. She leaned in closer, checking the bandage she was applying, her hair brushing against his jaw. For a moment, the world outside, Halloway, the scouts, the debt, ceased to exist. There was only the heat of the stove and the man who had bled for her. She finished tying the bandage and didn't pull away immediately. I am not a mistake, she agreed, her voice firming, and I am not a debt to be paid. Thorne's thumb brushed the inside of her wrist, right over her pulse point. No, he said, his voice dropping to a rumble that vibrated in her chest. You're the reason I'm waking up tomorrow. The morning sun didn't bring relief. It brought clarity, and with it, the sharp edges of their reality. The scout hadn't been alone, and he wouldn't be the last. Thorne moved stiffly as they packed the saddlebags, his shoulder significantly limiting his range of motion, though he refused to complain. Lynn worked alongside him, her movements efficient. She wrapped the remaining food, filled the canteens, and checked the load on the roan horse. The domesticity of it felt dangerous, a temporary fantasy they couldn't afford to indulge. They rode out before the dew had burned off the sagebrush, heading deeper into the broken country, away from the main trails. Thorne guided the horse toward a ridge of limestone cliffs that jutted out of the earth like broken teeth. There's a way station up ahead, Thorne explained as they rode, his voice strained. Run by an old friend, a widow named Martha. She has no love for Halloway. You'll be safe there for a few days while I finish this. Lynn stiffened behind him, her arms tightening around his waist. Finish this? She asked. You mean go back? Alone? Thorne didn't answer immediately, which was an answer in itself. I can't fight a war with you in the crossfire, Lynn. Halloway wants you to get to me. If you're safe, he has no leverage. They arrived at the homestead by mid-afternoon. It was a sturdy cabin built into the side of the cliff, protected by a natural overhang. An older woman with hair like spun silver and a shotgun in the crook of her arm met them at the gate. This was Martha. She looked at Thorne's shoulder, then at Lynn, and nodded as if she had expected them. Coffee's on, was all she said. Inside, the cabin was warm and smelled of dried herbs, but the safety felt like a trap to Lynn. While Martha busied herself in the kitchen, Lynn turned to Thorne. He was checking his revolver, spinning the cylinder with a distraction that didn't suit him. I am not staying here, Lynn said. She didn't shout. She stood her ground, feet planted on the rug, chin high. Thorne looked up, exhaustion etching deep grooves around his mouth. Lynn, be reasonable. I can't protect you out there, not like this. He gestured to his shoulder. I'm slow. I'm a liability. Lynn stepped forward, closing the distance. She reached out and took the gun from his hand, placing it on the table. It was a bold move, one that made Martha pause and watch from the doorway. You saved me from a cage, Lynn said, her voice steady. Do not put me in another one, even if it has a kind keeper. She took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. You said I needed to fight like I wanted to live. I want to live. With you. If you go back to face Halloway, you go with a partner, not a martyr. Thorne stared at her, the conflict warring behind his eyes. He looked at her hand in his, then at her fierce, determined face. The resolve in him to push her away crumbled against the reality of her strength. He exhaled, a long, ragged sound. It's dangerous, he warned. One last try. I know, she replied, but waiting is worse. The decision to stay together was tested sooner than they expected. They didn't make it back to town. The town came to them. Halloway, impatient and embarrassed by the failure of his scouts, had escalated. He had deputized a dozen men, miners, drifters, anyone who owed him money, and they had tracked the trail of blood and hoof prints. They struck at dusk, just as the sky was turning the color of a bruise. The first sign was the crack of a rifle shot that shattered the window of Martha's cabin. Thorne threw Lynn to the floor, covering her body with his own as glass rained down on them. "Back door!" he roared, dragging her up. Martha was already there, kicking the heavy door open. "Go up the ridge!" the old woman shouted, grabbing her shotgun. "I'll hold 'em here." Thorne hesitated, looking at his friend, but Martha shoved him. "Go! She's the one they want!" Thorne grabbed Lynn's hand and they ran. They scrambled up the goat path behind the cabin, lungs burning, the sound of gunfire erupting below them. It was a chaotic, terrifying ascent. The rocks were slick, the light failing. They reached a plateau, gasping for air, but they were cut off. Riders had circled around the flank. 3 men on horseback blocked the path, silhouettes against the dying light. Thorne raised his revolver, but his injury slowed him. A lasso snaked out of the darkness, not for him, but for Lynn. The loop settled over her shoulders and tightened with a brutal jerk, dragging her off her feet. She screamed, clawing at the rope, her heels digging into the dirt. Thorne roared, turning to fire, but a second rope caught his ankles, jerking him down hard. He hit the ground with a sickening thud, his gun skittering away over the edge of the cliff. He scrambled, trying to reach his boot knife, trying to crawl toward Lynn, but 2 men were on him instantly, kicking him, beating him down with the stocks of their rifles. Through the haze of pain and dust, he saw Lynn being hauled up toward a horse. She wasn't screaming anymore. She was looking at him. Her eyes were wide, terrifyingly clear. She reached for something at her waist, the bone-handled knife. But she didn't cut the rope. She met his eyes and mouthed the single word, "Wait." Then she allowed herself to be pulled up, surrendering to the capture to stop them from killing him. "No!" Thorne bellowed, his voice breaking, but a boot connected with his temple and the world went black. Waking up was a slow, agonizing process. The pain in Thorne's head was a rhythmic thudding that matched his heartbeat. He was alive. That was the first surprise. He was alone on the plateau. That was the first horror. He dragged himself to his knees, vomiting bile and dust. Martha was gone. The cabin below was a smoldering ruin, though he hoped she had slipped away into the tunnels she always bragged about. But Lynn was gone. The thought acted like a stimulant, sharpening his senses through the pain. They hadn't killed him because Halloway wanted a public spectacle, or maybe they thought he was dead. It didn't matter. They had taken her back to the town, back to the stage. He found his hat in the dust. He didn't find his gun. He staggered to his feet, swaying like a drunkard. He checked his belt. His knife was still there, and he had something else. Rage. A cold, focused rage that numbed the throbbing in his shoulder. He began to walk. He didn't run. He didn't have the strength. He walked with the inevitable momentum of a landslide. He reached the town limits just as the sun was hitting high noon the next day. The heat was identical to the day he had bought her freedom. The square was full again. Halloway was trying to recreate the moment, trying to overwrite his humiliation. Lynn was on the platform again, but this time she wasn't looking at the horizon. She was standing tall, her hands bound in front of her this time. She looked different. The fear was gone. She was scanning the crowd, waiting. Halloway was speechifying, talking about justice and the law, about how the bandit Thorne had kidnapped this poor woman. He was lying to save face. Thorne stepped out from the alleyway. He didn't have a gun. He walked into the open street, his duster heavy with dust, blood dried on his temple. The crowd saw him and gasped, parting like the Red Sea. Halloway froze mid-sentence. "You," the mayor sputtered, "you should be dead." Thorne kept walking. I told you, Thorne's voice carried, though it was raspy. I only regret waiting. Halloway panicked. Shoot him! He shrieked to his deputies. 2 men raised their rifles. Thorne didn't stop. He didn't flinch. But the shots didn't come from the deputies. They came from the platform. Lynn had moved. In the distraction of Thorne's appearance, she had used the bone-handled knife she had hidden in her sleeve, not to cut the ropes, but to slash the belt of the deputy standing nearest to her. As his gun belt fell, she snatched his revolver with hands that were bound but nimble. She didn't aim at the crowd. She fired into the air, 2 deafening cracks that shattered the tension. Stop! She commanded. Her voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was iron. The deputies hesitated, looking from the unarmed giant walking toward them to the woman holding a gun with terrifying steadiness. This man, Lynn shouted, pointing the gun at Halloway, is a thief and a liar. He sells people. He burns homes. She looked at the crowd. Who here does not owe him money? Who here has not been crushed by his law? The crowd murmured. They were angry, tired, and hot. Thorne reached the steps. The deputies looked at Halloway, then at the crowd, then at the gun in Lynn's hands. They lowered their rifles. They weren't paid enough to die for a mayor everyone hated. Halloway backed up, his face pale. This is anarchy, he screamed. Thorne walked up the steps. He didn't look at the mayor. He walked straight to Lynn. He gently took the heavy revolver from her bound hands. He holstered it. Then he took his knife and cut her bonds. You kept it, he said softly, nodding at the bone-handled knife she had tucked back into her sash. I needed it, she replied, her voice trembling now that the adrenaline was fading. Thorne turned to Halloway. The mayor was trembling. Thorne didn't kill him. He didn't need to. He ripped the badge off Halloway's vest and tossed it into the dirt. Walk, Thorne said. East. Don't stop. Halloway looked at the silent crowd, realized he had no power left, and ran. The aftermath was quiet. The town didn't celebrate. They just dispersed. The heavy blanket of fear lifted, replaced by the uncertain work of rebuilding. Thorne and Lynn sat on the edge of the water trough outside the livery stables, washing the dust from their faces. The horses were saddled. They weren't staying. There was no life for them here, and they didn't want to become the new law. They wanted something else. Thorne finished cleaning a cut on his cheek and looked at Lynn. She was braiding her hair, her fingers moving deftly. She caught him watching her. A small, tired smile touched her lips. We are even, she said. I saved you. You saved me. Thorne shook his head slowly. He reached out and took her hand, bringing it to his lips. He kissed her knuckles, a gesture so tender it felt out of place with his bruised face and bloodied knuckles. No, he said. We're not even. We're together. Lynn squeezed his hand. Where do we go? She asked. Thorne looked west, toward the mountains where the air was cool and the law was what you made of it. Anywhere we want, he said. The regret is gone. He helped her mount the roan, then swung up behind her. This time she didn't hesitate. She leaned back against him, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart as they rode out of the town and into the wide, open silence of their future.